Number of events in the past year that coalesced for me, that combined laid the groundwork for what I want to say this morning about my wandering in the wilderness and what I found. The first event was a sermon that Will preached at the beginning of Lent that began with the question of whether we are checked in or checked out on our spiritual journeys. On hearing those words, checked out, my ears were immediately on high alert. This was a familiar phrase to me. I use it frequently to berate myself for when I think I'm checking out, not paying attention, or not being present. It was a habit that I just couldn't seem to break. During his sermon, Will offered 4 practices based on Jesus' own journey in the wilderness and suggested that these practices might help us in our own journeys and serve as a gauge to determine the degree to which we were checked out or checked in. The first of these practices was naming our demons, the things that trip us up, hold us back, and as he put it, diminish our lives. This too caught my ear. The second event was just a few weeks ago while listening to Karen Bellicosa's reflection on, and my ears again were on high alert. There were so many things she said that morning that resonated deeply with me, evoking some distant memory, a kind of deja vu. Her phrase, the tenderest of threads. The words from Howard's End, only connect. The idea of synchronicity, how seemingly random and unrelated events seem to connect to one another. And the article she quoted about looking back to move forward. It was so reminiscent of something I had also been thinking about and something I had written about. But where? I keep a daily journal as part of my spiritual practice. And when I returned home that Sunday after Karen spoke, I got out my journals from the past year. I knew there was something in those journals that I needed to find. Finally, I found it in an entry from October of 2022. This is some of what I wrote that day. There is something that I want to remember or capture, some elusive thread that keeps appearing and disappearing, something about loss and connection, something universal to us all, but very specific to me as well. I feel like I've been teasing this thread forever. There was that word, thread. I then looked at the following pages in my journal where I had methodically listed all the books, all the articles, all the poetry I was reading, all the podcasts I was listening to, trying to identify that thread. But it eluded me. This leads me to the third event. My daughter and her family were fortunate to spend the summer in Europe, the month of July in London, and the month of August traveling on the continent. When asked where I would like to join them on their journey, I chose London. I went to London for the first time in the mid-70s, just after I graduated from college. I lived there for a year and a half, attending a small ballet school in Chelsea. It was a school made up of mostly young women, girls really, some as young as 15 or 16, who had traveled to London alone from places like Greece, Mexico, Zambia, Australia, Canada, Jamaica, the Philippines, the US, and of course there were local girls from England. At 21, I was one of the oldest girls there. I became close to 2 girls in particular, Lynn, an English girl, and Mary, a girl from Greece. The three of us even spent the summer before I returned home going to Greece to stay with Mary's family. That year and a half was one of the best times of my life. I have so many memories of that time in London and in Greece, and have thought about that period in my life and my friends often. And yet I had not seen or heard from them in nearly 50 years. I decided to see if I could find Mary and Lynn. So several months before my trip, I started my search. I Googled them. I found Mary on Facebook, living in Rhodes. Contacting her through Facebook meant I had to join Facebook. My attempt to message her yielded no results, probably due to some inept error on my part. I Googled Lynn, and up she popped on a company website. She looked exactly the same, but there was no contact information for her. So I emailed the company's email address, explaining a little bit about how I knew Lynn, and asking if they would be so kind as to forward my email on to her. The president of the company emailed me that very night, saying how he loved when things like this happened, and that he would be delighted to forward my email. What he didn't tell me was that Lynn no longer worked there, that she had retired, and unbeknownst to her, but lucky for me, he had not taken her off the website. The very next morning, I heard from Lynn. She too was delighted to hear from me and hoped that we would be able to get together while I was in London. She also forwarded my email to Mary, who, as it happened, would be arriving in London the day before I was due to return home. Apparently, 4 of the girls from the school who were the same age had kept in touch, and every 10 years gathered to celebrate those major milestone birthdays. This was one of those years. Another stroke of luck. I was so excited. It was all I could think of. Lynn and Mary and I emailed back and forth several times before my trip. And it was decided that Lynn and I would meet 2 days before I left, just the two of us. Since I was staying near Piccadilly, she suggested meeting at Eros. And I went, Eros? Is that the name of a restaurant? It turns out it's a huge statue of the Greek god of love, Eros, mounted on a pedestal in the center of Piccadilly Circus. On the day we were to meet, my daughter and my youngest granddaughter walked with me to Piccadilly. There were quite a few people milling about, but I spotted Lynn right away, descending the steps from Eros. I cannot describe the joy I felt in seeing her. Tears formed as we hugged. I introduced her to my daughter and my granddaughter, and my daughter took a picture of us there in front of Eros, and then they left us alone to catch up. We found a cafe with outdoor seating and settled in for more than 2 hours, reliving those days long ago and sharing the lives we went on to lead since then. The next day, I met Lynn and the others at Sloane Square in Chelsea. The moment I saw Mary walking towards us from the tube station, I felt that same elation that I had felt the previous day on seeing Lynn. She too looked exactly the same. We had tea and birthday cake and shared some stories and photographs and laughed a lot. We walked up King's Road to find the school, which had been located above a Methodist church. The school is long gone, but the church is still there. We exchanged emails and posed for pictures outside the side door of the church that we had entered every day for class. About a week after I returned home, I was talking to my sister, telling her about my trip. At one point I said, what are the odds that even in this day and age, I would be able to find them online that Lynn's boss hadn't taken her off the website, that they were planning to meet in London on the very week that I was there. My sister said, this is my older sister, and she says my name in her own way, but Laurie, I don't think odds have anything to do with it. I think it was the Holy Spirit. Taking that in, I hesitated before I said, I don't know what to make of it. What do you mean? My sister asked. I mean, why didn't I stay in touch? Why did I let them go? You and I grew up in the same household. You moved as often as I did, and you stayed in touch with people. I am in touch with no one from my past, except my siblings, and even them I check out on from time to time. My sister said she was reminded of a quote by Frederick Buechner. She couldn't remember the exact wording or the book it was from, but it was something to the effect that nothing that is lost can compare to what is found. I later searched online and discovered the quote originally came from one of Buechner's novels entitled Godric. And the main character, Godric, was reflecting on his own life and his impending death. And the exact quote reads, "What's lost is nothing to what's found, and all death that ever was, set next to life, would scarcely fill a cup." And I later found an essay that Buechner wrote later where he expanded a little bit more on this quote, entitled, "All's Lost, All's Found." In the weeks since that conversation with my sister, and returning to that thread that I have been teasing, I reread my journals and all my notes on Will and Karen's sermons, and that long list of books and podcasts and poems. And I came across the name of this poem that I had written down, but I was pretty sure I wasn't reading at the time. It was a poem entitled One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which I had first heard in the movie In Her Shoes. This movie was about the unbreakable bond between two sisters who lost their mother early in their lives to bipolar disease. Over the years, that bond was tested and nearly broken, and for a while, they lost each other. The younger sister was working as an aide in an assisted living facility and reading poetry to an elderly blind man. This was the poem she read, One Art, about mastering the art of losing. This poem puzzled me because the poet seemed to be saying that you could actually master the art of losing by practicing. Practice losing small things first, like your keys or your glasses, and then work your way up to losing bigger things, like losing a loved one. That none of those losses would be a disaster. But the way that the poem is constructed, it has a very tight construction, and there's a tension in this poem that belies the kind of the flippancy of the language. And so I looked up a couple critics and a little bit about her biography. And it turns out Bishop had experienced a tremendous amount of loss in her life. And that this particular critic thought, or was suggesting, that perhaps that the language of the poem was masking the truth, which was that there are some losses in life which are a disaster. And it's just finding a way to survive those losses. It suddenly occurred to me that this was one of my demons. That I thought I could master the art of losing. That I could minimize my risk that if I limited the number of people in my life, jettisoning them along the way, that there would be fewer people to lose in the end. What was I thinking? I don't think I was thinking. This was a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior set in place early in my life, long before I actually lost someone. It was a pattern developed out of fear and lack of trust. Now, what you may ask is, what does this have to do with the passage from John that Lucy read earlier? I chose this passage because of one line in that passage. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. Here was Jesus, whom Peter thought he would never see again, who he thought he had lost, and he jumped into the water and swam to shore. I think that Peter's reaction is something akin to what I felt when I saw Lynn descend the steps of Arrows in London and Mary walk up towards me from the tube station. The author, Nora Gallagher, in reflecting on this very same passage, has suggested that we are meant for relationship, that we are meant to respond, to swim toward Jesus and toward each other. And I'd like to close with the rest of that essay, or part of that essay that Buechner wrote later, that I mentioned earlier. We find by losing. We hold fast by letting go. We become something new by ceasing to be something old. Out of nothing, God creates something. Out of the end, God creates the beginning. All's lost, all's found. This summer, when I found my long-lost friends, I was given a second chance, and I took it.